me start with a simple question, which is, as a historian of women in Germany, what made you shift your gaze from writing from a scholarly genre to a deeply personal and often difficult to recount memoir? What made you go in the direction of writing a memoir? And I think you're mic'd, so I don't need to
I think
answer.
I'm mic'd. Thanks for the question, and thanks all of you for being here. And I want to reiterate that we very much welcome your questions as well, even if I'm not prepared for them. What made me switch? I've, of course, been writing scholarly work for 25 years. And really what made me move into this new genre was simply the experience of the stillbirth. I had not even been an amateur creative writer. I'm not someone who sort of privately journaled or anything like that. And this was in some ways a fascinating education about sort of the power of grief to kind of crack you open. What happened, I was very stunned to have a stillbirth, and the next morning I just started writing. I had no idea I had it in me. So really I started writing simply as a means of kind of almost self-comfort, therapy, and so on and so forth. But I quickly realized that there was a lot I wanted to communicate. And while I've always communicated in writing as a scholar, this was a different kind of communication, a different kind of voice. And it was clear to me that while one can certainly and should research pregnancy loss and infant loss, and there's a lot of work to be done there, there are certain things that can be communicated best through a deeply personal voice. And I wanted to explore that. I wanted to see where it took me. It was a kind of a, I heard someone once use the term creative urgency. In a time of personal crisis, there was a need to find this other avenue for creativity. It wasn't a plan.
Can I ask you to just give the bare outlines of what happened to you?
Yeah. I had a pregnancy. I was in my 40s. This was a late pregnancy, but desired. Had a teenage child already at the time. Had a very healthy pregnancy, low risk, and planned a home birth with a certified nurse midwife. And then basically there was a labor emergency and sudden placental abruption, probably, although the autopsy report is in fact inconclusive. And the baby was born still. What happened subsequently, and what for me is very much the emotional heart of my own experience and the memoir itself, is was finding a way to grieve. And I was very lucky in that when I went to the funeral home, met the funeral director, who was kind of a neighborhood character, it turns out, he told me something I didn't know, which was that I could visit the baby, and in fact I could take him home. It didn't take me long as a historian to recall that, yes, once upon a time people did that, but we now live in an age where, bodies are kept elsewhere. But for me to be able to take, the baby's name was Thor, that was kind of his nickname, to be able to take him home and spend time with him was enormously important, to be able to, in a sense, spend time getting to know him, having him be part of my life and my world, having him inhabit his house before the burial was enormously important to me. Subsequent to the burial, of course, there's a prolonged period of grieving where I had to ask myself the question that all mothers of stillborn children ask, regardless of the circumstances, is, might something have gone differently? Mothers of stillborn children always ask themselves the question, should I have stopped drinking wine even before I knew I was pregnant? There's always something you can ask yourself, if at that last prenatal checkup, maybe my doctor should have paid more attention to my concerns about slowed fetal movement. In my case, the issue at hand, of course, was might it have gone differently had I not had a home birth? So I sort of had to work through that question. Home birth is, of course, a matter of enormous passions and political controversy, so I was having to go through that process in a kind of a heated political environment. What happened eventually is what happens in cases of dramatic grief and dramatic loss, is that eventually in some way that becomes integrated into your life. The tragic experience becomes integrated into your normal life, and your normal life makes space for the lasting impact of that. The book takes us basically through the first year of my experience after the stillbirth.
I guess because before before I get to how women cope and do something creative with it, that grieving process. And I think there's so many important aspects of your book, but one of the key takeaways, there's many, but one of them is about the viewing.
Yes.
And so you briefly mentioned it in the introduction, but I think it might be helpful for people to understand the importance, at least for you and your partner, to view Thor and spend time with Thor and what that's like and why that was helpful and not morbid or odd.
You know, it's funny, when I talk about this part of the story to people who themselves have experienced pregnancy loss, they don't miss a beat. But many other people find it disconcerting to think that I spent time with a dead body, essentially. This is something, it turns out that this is legal. Many people think that can't even be legal, but it is. And again, it's regulated state by state about what exactly, what conditions, and who you need to register with to make sure that nothing unhealthy happens. But in stillbirth, it does have a very particular meaning and function because usually when you lose somebody, you have memories of them alive, of your time with them, of your physical sensations. With a stillborn baby, you don't have that. Once upon a time in hospital rooms, if you delivered a stillborn baby, the nurses whisked the baby away and you didn't even get to see it or hold it. And they thought that this was the way to make sure you didn't dwell on it and that not getting to know it would be helpful. Sometime in the 1980s, there was a bit of a reform. They realized that, in fact, it would be helpful for women to be able to hold their babies. So the practice, it became quite common to offer women the opportunity to have their stillborn children in the room with them for a little while, hold them, sing to them, take pictures, whatever was important to them. In my case, I was in the hospital at that time, and I was able to do that. But then subsequently, basically, I left the hospital. I understood that Thor would be going to the funeral home. And then when I went to the funeral home, again, the funeral director said, it was clear to him that I wasn't ready to say goodbye yet. And he said, you can visit. You can visit with him. You can take him home. And here's what you need to know. And here's how it works. You can do that. And I was enormously grateful because we don't know we can do that.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, there's no one way to grieve. There's no one way to move on. But I often find women, again, if given the opportunity to grieve in their own way, and that in and of itself would be an entirely other talk, because oftentimes society, or even ourselves, we stifle our own grief, and we don't allow that normal process to take place. But if that woman is supported, allowed to do what they need to do, they often, again, I don't know that I've met somebody who's written a book, but they serve as volunteers and peer support for women who are newly bereaved. So they do a lot of creative things that way. They start various organizations and so forth.